Okay, so as we said last week, we finished the complicated and actually fascinating subject of Onos Devarim, and now, and of course, that Agadata was very deep in understanding. Now we may get back to something that we can really sort of touch and feel a little bit better, because it has to do with business and the kinds of things that we traditionally learn in the Gemara. So on the bottom of Nut Tes Amud Beis is where the Mishnah starts. And so what we're going to be talking about, and we just touched on this last week, is the halachas of business. In other words, and this, of course, is sort of the meat and potatoes of what we live every day, is that when a person conducts business with someone else, there's sometimes a very fine line between what you can do and what you can't do. Now, we always say that you should always be a tzaddik, you should always err on the side of doing better, not sort of skimming the surface. But at the same time, the halacha does speak to what is the norm in business, and so the question is, what is considered to be deception? That you're actually deceiving someone, and on the other hand, not deception, but sort of the fine line of as I mentioned last week, Yale, you weren't here, but in the law we use the term puffery. I never heard it until I went to law school. So puffing isn't lying. You're puffing, okay? So you're making something larger than it is, but it's not considered a lie. So again, in halacha, we always say you should be lifnim mishur sadin, but there are times when we do things that are not usher, but yet we'll see the chilik here in the Gemara, and of course the halacha later, is that what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So I think from what the Mishnah is going to teach us, we can take away a lot in terms of what we do in our own lives and what's acceptable, what it's not. All right, so we'll start with the first principle, which is a ma'arvin peris beperis, that you cannot mix the peris, the fruit of one field, with the fruit of another field. In other words, when a person harvests fruit and he wants to sell, there is an assumption, at least, that the produce that will be sold is the produce from that field. Lamai nafkamina. What is the nafkamina? We'll see in a minute. So that there is a nafkamina. But as a general rule, you don't mix, because people have an expectation. Let's say, there's something here called Butler's Orchard, right? Butler's Orchard is a place where I go pick fruit, whatever. So if you were going to buy fruit from that orchard and you knew that that orchard had a quality to it, then your expectation is the person selling you fruit is from Butler's Orchard. It's not from Yitzchak's orchard or Yaakov's orchard. So understand here that this is something, it's an unwritten expectation that people have, that you can't mix produce. Now we're going to see in a minute where the exceptions are, but this is the general rule. Now, afilu chadashim b'chadashim. Now we're going to get into this in more detail. There's newer produce and then there's older produce. Says the Mishnah, afilu chadashim b'chadashim. Even new with new, which you have, I mean, what difference is it? It's coming out of the ground. Doesn't matter if it's on this field or that field. It's the same orange. It's the same grapefruit. It's the same whatever. So the chiddush is, afilu chadashim b'chadashim, you're not allowed to mix. Ve'ein tzorach loimer chadashim b'yeshonim. And kal v'chomer, without even having to say it, that you can't mix new with old. In other words, someone had fruit from a previous harvest. It was still very, very good, but it's not the same as new. So he says, in Tzarech Loimer, we don't even have to say it. It's understood that you can't mix new with old. Now, why does he say that? Because we're going to see a little bit later that with regard to other things than produce, we're pretty much talking about here he was referring to grain, but he means all kinds of produce, that we see that there are some exceptions later. So, but he says, and we shouldn't even consider new with old. Now, with regard to grain, it's very interesting. Something I didn't know, but this is the Mitzias that older grain, when it is threshed and prepared, yields a larger bounty of flour than a newer one. In other words, if it's old and already has some time under it, you actually get more produce, more flour than otherwise. So, l'chaira, when we say this, right, it should be okay to sell old with new. Because if you're selling new to thresh, and let's say you get, just making it up, the market says about saw, but let's say a pound of flour yields from this batch of grain. Now, if you take older grain, you'll get a pound and a half because it's already matured, so more grain comes out of it. So that l'chaira, what's the theory that you shouldn't mix old with new? Because old is going to yield more flour than new, right? So the chayra, that should be considered a benefit and not a negative.
So there's an implication on the cost, what the farmer is going to sell it for.
Right. So if again, so we have to be careful. If you say I'm selling you older grain, which someone has the expectation that it will yield a pound and a half from the produce, if you mix chadashim, you're going to diminish the amount that he gets. But the other way around, if I say to you, Jay, I'm selling you from this brand new batch of grain that I have here, selling you such and such amount of grain. He says, fine. He knows what he's going to get because he's experienced. Then I mix in Yeshenim, and all of a sudden, he's got more than he bargained for. So that's not an Isser. So ve'ein tzarich lemer chadashim b'yeshanim means that you can't mix chadashim into yeshanim, but you can mix yeshanim into chadashim, because anything that's considered an improvement, the Chazal say we're not going to forbid it. It doesn't implicate taste, has nothing to do with quality. It's simply quantity. That more flour comes from an old stalk than from a new stalk. So that's what we have to understand.
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So this puzzles me. So if I don't distinguish, I mean, it's saying it's an Isser, but if I don't distinguish and I'm just selling grain, and it could be a combination, and I don't distinguish, so I pull it all together. You're saying the Mishnah is saying I can't do that, even if I tell people it's a mixture of old and new. It has to be delineated and sold separately.
No, that's not correct, because as long as you announce, and we'll see how this Mishnah develops here, but if you say, I'm selling grain and it's a combination of new and old, and I'm selling it for X dollars a pound. So someone now knows what he's in for. If he wants just old grain and not any new, then he'll say, I don't want to buy it because you're going to diminish the quantity of my grain because you're mixing in new. If a person doesn't care, but he knows up front that the mocher, the seller, has made it clear that he is selling combined grain, then it's okay. Typically in the Mishnah, what we're talking about is when that was not stated. In other words, it was not announced, I'm selling a mixture of new and old grain. That's what you need to know.
But if I don't announce it, I can't mix it, is what.
That's correct.
So if I mix it, I have to label it as such, and otherwise I have to distinguish between new and old in terms of what I sell.
Right, but let me make a chilik. If a person is known to be selling old grain, because that's what he has in his silo. Remember, a lot of this, as we'll see from the Mishnah, was stuff that was harvested, threshed, winnowed, and then put into silos where they later sold them to the public. So if a person says, I am selling this year's harvest new grain, then it's understood that if he adds old grain to it, that would be okay because the old grain can only improve the quantity of the grain. It's the other way around, and that's what the Mishnah says. Ve'ein tzorach lo mechadashim b'yeshanim.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
um, sorry to interrupt, and I'm trying not to read ahead in honor of Rabbi Hyatt, but to taking a quick look at just the first Rashi, it seems like Rashi is pointing out it's not just a question of mixing new grain and old grain. The seller is saying, I'm going to sell you from this particular field.
right.
And then the question is whether he's mixing something in with that, from another field. So it's more than, to me anyway, it's more than just, I'm going to sell you old grain and then you mix in some new, or new and sell some old. It's focused on a particular field. And then the question is whether you're going to kind of mix and match from different fields.
Right. But yeah, what you're looking at, that Rashi, is the first Rashi of the Mishnah, which started out in Ma'arvim Paris Beparis, that if someone announces, I am selling the grain from field X, everybody
Right.
knows field X. Then Rashi says correctly that ani mocheloch kach v'kach soil lo yarvenu beparis soda acheres. For whatever reason, not necessarily quantity, but if you say I'm selling you from field X,
A.
then you have another field Y. You can't mix it from field Y to field X, regardless of Chodesh and regardless of Yashan, regardless of anything. That's one head note. Then we went to the second head note, and we said, you know what? If a person designates a field, then it doesn't matter if the other field is like kind, meaning Chadashim b'Chadashim. Doesn't matter. You have announced that you're selling it from field X, and people may have a perception that field X is a better field than field Y. All right, that's point number two. Point number three is that once you say that you can't mix new to new, then for sure you can't mix new
Too old.
Into old. Because why? Because old has a quality that it yields 1.5 pounds of flour per bushel. And now if you're going to mix new, it'll only be 1 pound. So we're taking it step by step. First, you can't mix fields. Then you can't mix chadashim b'chadashim. But ain't tzarich lomer chadashim b'yishanim. But on the other hand, you can mix old into new because you're only improving the new.
It's a benefit.
No one's going to say, I'm buying chadashim at a certain quantity, so don't give me something that increases my quantity. No one's going to say that.
But Rabbi,
yeah,
I'm troubled by, first of all, the field delineation. So if I have two fields, one is organic and one is not organic.
Okay, there you go.
And I don't have enough to make up from the field that's inorganic, and I add from the organic field to fill the quantity requested by the buyer, I'm not allowed to do that?
L'chayra not. L'chayra not. Because a person is buying only the produce in that field, and he happens to know that field is organic. And he's a purist, he wants only organic. If you're going to sell him a mixture of organic and something else, you're going to deceive him.
But I'm saying the other way. If I bought only regular, not organic, and I didn't have enough to fulfill the order, do I have to tell him that I'm going to add organic to that order? Because I'm making it theoretically better than, because there's no quantity difference, assuming it's the same time and it's not it's not old versus new.
So yeah,
it's a better quality, so therefore I still can't do that.
Right. So before I answer that, and again, the Mishnah didn't know from organic, not organic. We didn't know from those things. What we knew was that a Yashan gave more quantity than a Chadash, and since quantity matters, it's not forbidden to add a Yashan into a Chadash, but it's forbidden to add a Chadash into a Yashan. That's what we know.
But if the Yashan is from another field,
at that point, it doesn't matter where it's from because the bottom line is going to be quantity. And in other words, if a person is a machbid and he comes to tell you, Mr. Seller, I want the produce of that field, that's what you have to sell him. If he doesn't say that, now we have to see what's going to be better for him. You can only make it better for him, not worse. But you're asking about something that I'm not 100% sure how that translates. Because l'chayra, let's say organic is better than not organic. Let's just say that it's better. That if given a choice for the same money, a person would want to buy organic. So if you have organic and you say, I'm selling you organic, and then you realize I'm short some of the produce to sell organic, and I want to mix other stuff in, then in that situation, you can't do it because we're looking strictly at the quality, and organic is better than non-organic. The only reason why the Mishnah says you could make that thing is because it's a quantitative benefit, and everybody will want that.
Even if the inorganic is Yasha.
Yeah, yeah. L'chayra. Again, I'm thinking out loud because we're dealing with a different Metzias. So, but you know what? The important thing is, Michael, always you have to announce. Once you announce, then you know that changes the equation. It's when someone comes to a seller and the seller has to make a decision. What should I do here? He didn't tell the fellow it's from field X, field Y, it's Yashan, it's Chodesh. He just said, you know what? I want to make this sale, and this is what I'm going to do. So the principle is that you can't mix Chodesh with Yashan, but you can mix Yashan into Chodesh, right?
Rabbi,
Yeah,
just to Michael's question, it seems to me, that what the Mishnah is saying is, if the buyer comes and says, "I want from field A," you don't have the option of swapping out anything other than field A because that's what in other words, the Mishnah, that's the first statement of the Mishnah. If it didn't make a difference, then the person would say, I want from, then we get into the question of Yashan or Chadash, you have to do something better. But the Mishnah seems to say, if a person says, I want from field A, that's it. Even if field B is better, and even if swapping out some of field B for field A will give him a better purchase, the Mishnah says and Rashi says you cannot swap out one for the other. It's not looking. Rashi's not saying, well, maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. It just says if he says field day, that's it. You're locked.
right, right. Now let's look at the Rashi on the top of Samach Hamad Aleph. Ve'ein tzarech lo mechadashim b'yishanim. In other words, it's a foregone conclusion. Pasuk limud chalo yishenim lo yarav behen chadashim. If he's set to sell him Yeshenim, Yashan, which yields more of a quantity, he shouldn't mix Chadashim, right? Shayeshenim Yeveshin, they're dry, right? V'osin Kemach Yosem and a Chadashim, and it makes a Kemach more than a Chadash. So that's what the Mishnah is telling us is that if you're saying I'm selling you new, then you're allowed to add old because the old will improve the quantity, and at least from the purposes of the Mishnah, quantity is what we're looking at. We're looking at how much the yield is, not is it better, is it not better because it's new or because it's not new. It's simply a question, Rashi says, of quantity, and it's a kemach yoser. Therefore, you're allowed to mix the Yoshan into the Chodesh without telling the buyer that you're doing that.
But Rabbi, the other thing about that is, isn't there a higher potential for spoilage for Yoshan than there is Chodesh?
Apparently not. Apparently, if they dried it properly and put it into the silo or stored it, then it's again, there's no mention of it, but we're talking apples to apples, so it's not going to be a question of spoilage. If it was, then you're right. You're right, Michael. If there's a greater propensity for Yoshan to be spoiled, then unless he tells them specifically, I'm giving you this Yoshan to increase your quantity, but there may be some spoilage here. Again, nothing beats being specific. The Mishnah is only talking when you're not specific.
Yeah, I think that there's two different kinds of spoilage out there. I remember reading something about this several years ago. You've got things like mold and stuff like that, which and then you've also got bugs.
Right.
And some of that are things where you might not know until you really get into it and see, oh, this isn't so good and whatever, and you lose bits and pieces, and that could would logically be worse the older it gets. The other part, though, is with bugs, where I remember reading something. It might have been an Israeli innovation. I'm not sure, but where they've come up recently with ways to try to store the grain in silos and other things in a way, but in ways that help seriously prevent the bug problem. So I don't know how much this was a problem in ancient Israel, but that's something where you could have, fields that have been, plowed, harvested, and the grains piled up in inside silos or whatever they did. And a year later, now you need this grain, and all of a sudden you open it up and you find that the whole thing is ruined. So these are possibilities. So presumably, if that happened, your buyer would just reject the lot.
Yeah. I think for purposes of our
It's a big
Mishnah, though, we're focused on one thing.
We're assuming it's usable.
Yeah, in other words, the quantity. So, but you're right. These are all questions that they sort of lurk in the background, and the question is, what do we do with them? Again, we'll see some of this later on as well. But for our purposes, this whole discussion has to do with quantity, and the Mishnah is making very clear that there are advantages to Yashin over Chodosh. Therefore, that you can do, but not the other way around. Okay, so that's the first part of the Mishnah. In other words, this is how you have to conduct your business to the public, is that you can't just mix randomly, but you can mix to improve for the buyer without...
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Down the road, is there any discussion when it comes to grinding the flour to make matzah for Pesach?
Not on this... Yeah, go ahead.
Does this discussion of mixtures and so on ever show up later in the issue of making matzah for Pesach?
Well, yeah, but that's I mean, in Pesachim, that's a whole different discussion, right? I mean, in terms of what you can mix and what you can't mix for matzah, that's a separate discussion.
The biggest thing is that it's normally we say that it should be what do you call it? A shmira shatz ksira, which your ordinary grain, you just wouldn't be concerned about that. So I would assume that then, as now, that if they had a reasonable thought that this field I might go ahead and use for Pesach stuff, that then you'd have extra shmira, however that's defined and however that's done, involved, that you just wouldn't bother with for your stam field.
But yeah, for selling, yeah.
But wouldn't the oldest stuff start asking questions about the purity of it to make matzah? I'm asking whether there's any connection down.
Well, your shmira would have to be would be a longer term thing. You've already harvested it, and now it's sitting. And now instead of watching it for a month or 6 months, because remember you usually make your matzah in advance. So instead of watching it from the previous Shavuos till Hanukkah time, now it's Shavuos to Hanukkah plus a whole nother year. You've tripled how long it has to have been watched to make sure that it didn't get
if that sits there, right. So I wouldn't mix the two, Jay, right now. I wouldn't mix the two. It's a separate discussion. Okay, so that's the first part of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah goes on and says, very interesting, Be'emes Amru. Now, how often do you see this terminology? The emes is... So what does it mean? So we're going to understand a little bit later what Be'emes Amru means, but the Mishnah says Be'emes Amru, in point of fact, in truth, B'yayin hetiru la'orev kosher barach. Okay, so now we're moving from grain to wine, right? And we say that it's permitted to mix kosher, meaning hard, stronger wine, barach into milder wine. Okay, it's kind of like Yoshan and Chodosh, but it's permitted to mix a stronger wine into milder wine. Why? Because you improve the wine. In other words, wine is something that, the stronger it is, the more tasty it is, the better it is. So if you're selling to the public, remember, this is now someone selling wine, and he says, this is the wine I'm selling. And the guy says, okay, fine, I'm going to buy this wine. And then he finds that he's short some of the wine that he wants to sell. And that happens to be the mild wine. In other words, it hadn't gone through a period of sitting and fermenting. Then he's allowed to take from the yosha, from the, what we call yosha, but from the kosher, and mix it barach, because no one will complain when he gets stronger wine as opposed to weaker wine. So that kind of parallels what we say before about that that you want to old and new in a different way. This is a different thing. Now, what about the other way around? What happened that if he aval no okay, because it makes it better. Now, what happens the other way around? If you're selling wine and you're selling this nice strong wine and then you run short, you say, you know what? I'm just going to mix a little bit of this newer wine that doesn't have the same strength. Then that is forbidden because that's the antithesis of what we were saying. That's the chodesh b'yashan. Now, you can't mix chodesh into yashan. You can mix yashan to chodesh. Same way, you can mix kosher into rach, but you can't mix rach into kosher for the same reason. Again, it's deceptive because the person is expecting to have a certain strength of wine, and you're diluting it, right? That's what it is. Now, it comes to Pesach, oftentimes we see that people do dilute because, I mean, you can even buy less strong wine for the kaisis, but people do dilute because they don't want to drink a stronger wine. It's a separate question whether or not if you're selling yain b'Pesach and you announce, I'm selling a milder version of this strong wine. Again, the bottom line is if you announce and make it clear, then you always have the advantage of not being over on any isser of deceptive practice. But all this Mishnah is talking about where a seller, he's in a bind. He's got a customer wants to buy something. He's got to make a quick decision. Do I mix? Do I not mix? Do I give him this? Do I give him that? So the Mishnah is telling us, here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. Now, so having said that about wine, the Mishnah then goes on and says, Ein ma'arvin shimre yayin b'yayin. Now, we all know, or maybe some of us, most of us know, that when you ferment wine, when you go through the process, there is a sediment that falls to the bottom of the keg, and that sediment is not really good. I mean, you don't drink it. When you sell wine, you sell it with the sediment, but the sediment itself is not something that you say, I'm going to sell the sediment. So the halacha here tells us, a ma'arvim shomer yayin b'yayin, you can't mix the sediment of one wine into the sediment of another wine. And again, on the face of it, it makes perfect sense because when you have a casket of wine that let's say you leave for 6 months, and another casket that may be there for 10 months or a year. Okay, so let's just say that each
it's one correct. It's cask, not casket. Casket's a dead body. Cask is a barrel of wine.
Cask. Thank you, Menashe. Right. All right. So when you have a cask and the sediment from one wine it comes out, then those two sediments will not be alike. So therefore, you can't take this. Say, you know what? No big deal. I'm going to mix the sediments and hanahach. It's the same thing. Says the Mishnah, a ma'arvim shomer yain b'yain. You can't mix a sediment with sediment. Now, but the next statement, l'chayra, is a problem. Aval noiselo es shmarav, but he can sell it with its sediment. So in other words, we have two separate things. We're going to see how that comes together because there's going to be a kasha here. But you can't mix one sediment with another sediment from two different wines, but you can mix the sediment from that wine. It's another. If a person says, I'm selling you a gallon of wine, and within that gallon, let's say there is a mashu, I don't know what amount, of sediment, so that the wine is not really fully a gallon. Are you cheating him if you sell it with the sediment? That's the kasha. Says the Mishnah, no, because the expectation is that if I take the wine out of the cask and I want to sell him a certain amount, then there will be some sediment that comes along with that wine, and that's understood. Now, you can ask a kasha if a person says, I don't want it, I'll pay more just to get the wine, not the sediment. Separate issue. Maybe you can do that. I mean, if that's what he wants and you can accomplish that, you do. But in the norm, when a person says, give me, please take from this cask a gallon of wine for me, then he can pour off the wine with the sediment and he can give it to him. So, and that's clear. What's again, what we're going to find out, what's not clear is how the two mix together. A ma'arvim shomer yayin b'yayin, but you can mix the yayin with its sediment. We'll understand that a little bit later. But okay. Now look at Rashi. Why are you allowed to mix, in this case, old and new? Mipnei shemashbicho kosher mashbiach es harach. The old improves the new. Lefikach posuk imo rach maravo kosher, but dafka katani kosher barach. We're only talking about kosher in tarach, v'lo rach bekosher. Posuk imo kosher lo yaravo es harach. So that's what we said earlier. That when the Mishnah says ve'ein torach lo mechadoshim b'yishonim, that it says, if needless to say, you don't have to say that you can't mix the new into the old. Rashi's saying he means specifically the new into the old, but not in the old into the new, as we explained, because the old only improves the new, so it's fine. Ein ma'arvim shomer yayin b'yayin b'gemar mafarish lo. All right, so the Gemara is going to explain to us that what it means you can't mix sediment with sediment, because there's a kasha here, but we'll hold off until the Gemara explains. Okay, so now we've talked about grain and we've talked about wine, and we sort of, for purposes of deceptive practices, you see where this is going. That you can always sell an improved version of what someone wants to buy without telling him. You can't sell a less improved or a weaker product into a better product without telling him, because that would be considered deceptive practice. That's what we take so far from the Mishnah. Okay, now we'll take it one step further. Mi shidis arav mayim biyeno. Okay, so there was, I guess, a common practice. I don't know if it's done much anymore, where they took the wine and they mixed water, a certain amount of water. They knew how much. They water into the wine. So again, to the question we had before, and Michael, what I've said is, lo yim karenu b'chanut, you should not sell it in the store, meaning on a retail level, ela imkein hodio, unless you notify. So here we see that notification supersedes what we would expect to be the right halacha. Of course, you shouldn't mix water with wine. You're deceiving him, says the Mishnah. Yes, you're deceiving him, but if you tell him, it's not deception. In other words, if he knows that there's a certain quantity of water going into this wine, it's permitted. Okay?
It's like the gas station with ethanol, 10%.
Right. How much, right? What the quantity is. They have big signs that always say how much percentage.
They learned this Mishnah.
They learned this Mishnah, right? Exactly. They know what the halach is. All right. So that's one point. But velosager afa pishahodio. You can't sell water mixed with wine to a wholesaler who then is going to go into the marketplace and resell, even if you notify him. Why? It's very interesting, and what Rashi says.
Because he doesn't have to be tell the people.
He doesn't what?
Buyers. He doesn't have to tell the buyers.
That's right. So there's not a
claim he doesn't know.
Right. So there's not accountability. Very good. That's the point. So it says, so Rashi says, pruta pruta, meaning penny by penny. That means retail. Ela imkein hodio l'chol echad ve'echad mehem shemayim ba'arvabo. So he has to announce to anybody who's coming up to buy, oh, by the way, there's some water in this wine. But lo l'tager yimkerenu biyachad va'afa pi shemodio. Even if you tell the tager, by the way, I'm selling you this wine with some water in it. Why? Lefi she'eno lokech el ramos. A wholesaler, his inclination is to cheat because how does he make his money? He makes his money on the margins. So by being a wholesaler and so in other words, you can't rely on him. On a storekeeper, he deals directly with the public. Okay, he has to keep their trust and everything else. But the wholesaler is now selling not to a buyer but to another retailer, and the principle is she'ena el ramos. Interesting how they treated the wholesalers at the time.
Rabbi, I'm troubled by this on
Yeah,
multiple levels. So, the thing is that wine in those days had a much higher alcohol content than
right,
we see today. So I could see that there's a market for people who did not want as much fermentation to
right,
dilute it some and sell it as a diluted product. So, I mean, obviously you have to relate what that composition is, but you
right,
can sell it. What I don't understand between the retail and the wholesaler is the wholesaler could do the same thing himself, and you're saying, well, the retailer can't sell the wholesaler in that form, but the wholesaler can dilute it down and sell it as he pleases without having to announce anything. It seems like everyone should have the responsibility to say what they're selling. So I don't understand why why we're limiting that to retailers to wholesalers when the wholesaler can do it on his own and deceive the public. Sounds like the wholesaler doesn't have to announce it to the public.
But can't they tell the amount of dilution just by tasting
You
it?
should be able to do it by tasting and by looks. I mean, it would look very different with more water, and the color would be different. It would be more diluted. You'd see it. So
right.
I
So
don't understand how, okay, so wholesalers are less honest. We know that from the Mishnah,
yeah.
but they're going to do it anyway. So it's
So,
okay if
so,
they
so,
do
uh,
it, but not if the
yeah,
retailer sells it.
it's an interesting point because you're right, they may do it anyway. But I think from the standpoint of the Mishnah, the seller should not be complicit. In other words, what the merchant will do, what the wholesaler will do, he'll do. There's no way of controlling what he does. But you have some measure of control if you yourself don't sell to him. You're kind of like leaving him to his own devices. He will either do it or not do it. But if you cut it, in other words, if you put the water in, then it's an open door for him. He may even cut it even more. In
It's
other words, there
amazing,
may be
Rabbi.
even,
It's
yeah,
amazing because how times have changed because light beer is watered down beer and it has its own popularity in itself. So we would consider it a different product from, full alcohol beer and full caloric beer because
right,
obviously people are weight conscious. But at those times, I mean, they didn't differentiate. Everything that was stronger was better because you're getting more, even if you adjust the price. So that's by definition better, but it's not necessarily, it's better only if the buyer wants it that way. And the presumption was all buyers want it that way because they're getting more for their same money, presumably. But the
yeah.
pricing had to build that in. So I find that, I mean, looking at it in today's views where you see lighter wine coolers and light beers compared to is a different product, not necessarily the same. And it's ironic that you're not paying much different for a light beer than you are for a full.
Well, right. So again, there's a fine line here, and I think what the mission is trying to say and distinguish between a wholesaler and a retailer is that when you sell it to the retailer, um, and and he tells his customer, oh, by the way, there's some water in this, then face to face with the buyer, okay, the buyer can decide, I don't want this wine or I do want this wine. And like you say, maybe it was too strong in the beginning and weakening it makes it better in some sense. But when you're selling sort of to a wholesaler, it's kind of an anonymous sale. Okay, you're not dealing with the public. We're concerned about the public. The public is our main, the buyer, the end buyer is our main concern. So if you sell the retailer sells it and he announces, now you can make a choice. But to sell it to a wholesaler, and it's already cut, meaning that there's water in it. And he'll say, you know what? No one's going to notice if I put in a little bit more water. You're right. They had a bad name. The wholesalers had a bad name that they're out there lurking on the margins, and therefore, even if they buy it knowing that it has water in it, they'll still dilute it even further. That's l'chayra what the Mishnah is trying to tell us is that they have no nemanis. Why? Again, probably there was a good reason at the time of the Gemara is that they saw what wholesalers were doing, and maybe today would be different. But for them, again, today maybe there's a certain sophistication in the palate, and you can tell better. It's diluted, it's not diluted. There's no question about it. I'm no maven, but when I buy certain wines for Pesach and it says 4% alcohol instead of 8% alcohol, I know the difference. Even with my uneducated palate, I know that it's a weaker wine, and therefore it's better for me on Pesach. But when it comes to the wholesalers, then I think that the Mishnah seems to indicate that they have a predilection to wanting to cut it further. Therefore, even if you tell them that you're not supposed to sell it to them. Again, I think there's a certain acceptance to what the practice was at the time. It may be different today, but that's the distinction. Ramos, because they go in knowing the wholesalers go in knowing that whatever they buy, whether it's even if it's cut already, I'm going to cut it further to make it go further, and that's how I'll make my money. Anyway, again, that's something we can go around and around, but I think for purposes of the Mishnah, let's accept that that was the practice of the time. Now, mokom shenogu lahatal mayim biyayin. Bo, if there was a place, in other words, you were living in a community where everybody put mayim into the yayin, then yatilu, then he may put it in. In other words, again, this is deceptive practice. So if there is no standard, you have to announce because no one will know. Do you or don't you? But if you live in an area, again, he wants to make it clear that announcing it always is the better thing. So if you live in a community where mayim is always put into it, right? Then there's no problem because everybody knows I'm going to buy this wine and it's going to have water in it. It's where you live in a community where that is either optional or not the norm that you have to announce. So again, the Mishnah wants to distinguish between one locale and another locale. A locale where there is a specific way of selling, and then you want to put water in it, you have to announce. But in a locale where everybody puts water in, because that's the nature of how they sell wine, then yatilu, you can put it in and you don't have to announce. Again, it's not a deceptive practice if you do that. Okay, so
and Rabbi, you can sell to wholesalers in that community?
In that community, you can sell to the wholesaler, correct, because you have the expectation that it will be cut. Yes. You have the expectation that mayim will be in it.
But he might cut it some more because that's who he is. He's a wholesaler.
Okay. All right, so okay, so Rashi says mokem shenogu lahatal mayim biyayin yatilu, where they cut it with water, it's okay. The kiven shenohogu, since that was the minig, ain't kantos, there's no mistake. Shekol hayainos becheskas kain. In other words, so your question is, okay, everybody knows that the wine is cut with water. But the tager, the wholesaler, will cut it again, right? That's what you're concerned about. He'll cut it again, so we shouldn't be able to sell it to him. That's, I mean, again,
it sounds like everybody has to know what's going on, so we're not under any delusions about the delusions.
About the delusion. Right. So again, that's a fine line, Michael, because you're right. So to one extent, anytime if the tiger has such a bad reputation, then no matter what, even if you cut it, he'll cut it again.
See, I'm troubled by that, Rabbi, because if you label everything that you're doing, if you're required to specify, then even the wholesalers, I mean, it's basically saying if you're a wholesaler, you're a ganef. And that's troublesome because I can't imagine that all wholesalers were ganovim.
Right.
Maybe that's true, but it's taking, it's basically saying if that's your profession, you're a ganef. And people are supposed to treat people straight. I can understand denouncing. Obviously you can taste it. There's a way of tasting it, but then to say you can't sell to them under any circumstances a diluted product, in a place where it's not automatically diluted, it's sold there, is, as long as you specify, it should be fine.
Right. Right. So
today in Eretz Yisrael, you go to the wine vineyards to buy wine. They always give you tasting first,
right.
before you buy a bottle.
And by the way, Jay, you're hitting on something that the Gemara is going to discuss a little bit later. That very, very point to answer a question is because for that reason, because people do taste. But yeah, go ahead. Right. Tasting becomes an important component in understanding some of the Gemara. Right.
When the wholesale sells, I'm sure the retailer also tastes the wine before he takes it.
I mean, Shalom does wine tastings too. I mean, but it reminds me of a mushal, and I think it's not directly the problem here, but I think it's useful. I'm reminded of this, which is the idea that there was a shul in town. There was the rich shul and the poor shul, and the rich shul had every year they would have a big kiddush, let's say Simchas Torah, and they would have this, and and the poor shul's like, how do they do that? It's like, oh, well, let's get together, and everybody will add a little bit of schnapps each week when they come to shul. And we'll have this by the end of the year. We're going to have this big barrel full of schnapps, and we'll be able to all celebrate together. So for one person, they start doing that, and one person thinks, if I put water in instead of schnapps, it'll be a little bit diluted, and nobody will know. And the next person thinks, next thing you know, a year later, they open it up, and the thing's practically all water. So the dilution, you sometimes think a little bit here, a little bit here, that it doesn't matter, but it can.
Yeah. Let me think about that, Michael, because your question is whether or not if you're in a place where it is customary to mix with water, are you allowed to sell to the tiger? Because the whole point of the tiger was that he would cut corners. And so, but here, everybody cut corners. The question is he cutting the corner of a corner? In other words, even if everybody cuts corners, he's going to go one step further. Let me think about that because I don't. I mean, the Mishnah does not exclude the tager, but it's an interesting question. In other words, in a community where they mixed water, does that preclude the tager from buying because he'll or not? Okay, that's
one of the very practical issue, which is that we have elsewhere. We have that. I don't remember the exact word, but the whole thing about you can't have two different weights and two different sizes, etc., different categories. Problem here is that today, actually, you would have the government would come in. I say certainly do with gasoline to double check the octane, et cetera, to actually test stuff to make sure that it is what it's supposed to be.
Right.
Back then, I don't think it probably could be done, but not so easily, other than roughly, but subjective by taste, to say, okay, is this thing 10% watered down? Is it 20% watered down? And so on. It's easy to say, is this a full quart or is this a pound or whatever? But it's very hard to compare and figure out the exact ratios.
And does that change now that we have the ability to
that's
do that?
That's my point. In other words, in the modern world, and I'm sure it happens in some industries, like I said, I know they do with gasoline to test the octanes and so on, that you could actually test it.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Again, it's a fine line. I have to take a little more look into it, whether or not this precludes the tiger. That's your question, Michael. Whether it precludes the tiger where it is the custom to put wine, should you still avoid the tiger because he'll cut it even further than what people have an expectation? Okay, we'll look at that. Now, the last part of the Mishnah, Hatager notel mehe granos. Again, what are the expectations? So a tiger means like a wholesaler, not someone who's selling to the public, but a tiger may take um, grain mehe granos. He means from five different threshing floors, as an example. The nos of the toch magura achas, and put it into one silo, one place to gather. Why? Because again, that's the expectation. It's all about expectations. If a wholesaler goes around during the threshing season, he may not be able to fill a silo from one field or two fields or three fields. He needs to go to as many fields, hey, as an example, as many fields as he can to fill that silo. So there's an expectation in the public. Again, it's all about what the expectations are. If your expectation is that's only coming from one field, okay, then you're going to be cheated. But everybody knows that when it comes to the threshing season, then wholesalers go around and buy, one lot here, two lots here, three lots here, and then they put them together so that all that grain becomes commingled, and it's acceptable.
But Rabbi, they're selling to retailers.
Correct.
So everything that
so all the storekeepers know that that's what the tiger is doing.
Yeah, but the thing is, the retailer that they're going to purchase it from, so you're saying everything that came before that you're not allowed to take from two different fields. You're not, so that if it's a wholesaler that it's bought from, all bets are off. That doesn't govern.
That's the expectation. That's the expectation, correct. If the expectation were that there's an abundance of grain from every field, then l'chayra, you might have to say, I have to separate out the grain from field A or field B and not commingle them. But the Metzias was that was not the case. So the Mishnah is saying that, you know what, in the case of a wholesaler, he has the permission to collect and put it together because the retailers know that that's what he's doing. Again, it's a question of knowledge, so that the retailers know that the practice of the tiger was to go around from field to field and do that.
But interestingly enough, if someone is selling direct and they also purchase from a wholesaler because they are a huge grain seller.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to delineate what you get from the wholesaler and what you get from your own fields. If you're, a big macher in not just selling your own produce, so you have to delineate that, and you have to follow from your own fields the other rules. And whatever you buy from a wholesaler, all bets are off, and you have to specify that this was bought from a wholesaler and this was what we were able to grow ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a perception that since if the tiger cornered the market, everything would be diluted. Now, if a retailer has a private stock, and that stock comes from one field, then fine. Then he can announce and say, "I'm selling this, but I'm selling it for more money because it comes from one field. Or it's not mixed." Again, this is about publicizing, about making it clear that you're not deceiving somebody. No one's deceived if everybody knows that retailers buy from wholesalers and wholesalers buy from five different fields. No one's deceived. No one's deceived.
So the wholesaler is exonerated from any of these rules because it's
that's the practice.
It's compromised. So
right.
You don't have, by definition, if you're buying directly from a wholesaler, that's what's going to happen. But otherwise, everyone has to be machmir on it's only from this field versus that.
No. But if a retailer is buying from the wholesaler, he knows he's buying from a mixture of fields. He's not under any delusion that he's buying only from field X or field Y. So when he sells, it's kind of down the chain. Everybody knows how this works. That grain is gathered from the threshing floor, and unless you're told specifically this is exclusively from one field, it's not.
So
That's the norm.
the retailer's in a bind unless everything is gotten from a wholesaler, then it's all bets
Mixed.
are off.
All bets are off. It's mixed.
But if there's a combination of how the retailer gets from his own fields and buys wholesale,
Yeah,
he has to delineate
exactly.
the gradations. Okay.
Degradations, exactly. Now says the Mishnah weiter. So now that is the story by grain. Now also mehei gitos v'nos pitam echad. If he takes it from 5 vineyards, right? Again, or 5 presses. In other words, the grapes come in, they're pressed. Uh, I don't know if pressing in press one or press two or press three, if it's a different quantity or quality of the wine, but you can do the same thing that you and he can put them into one cask, even if they come from 5 different vineyards. In other words, there's no difference between grain and wine on this point because um, that's the norm. That is the norm. Okay. Now that we said all of this, look at the last line. As long as he doesn't have the kavana to mix uh, different qualities of wine. If you're doing it from a press and every press at the same time is pressing the same grapes, not likely that there's going to be a difference between A, B, C, D, E because they're all the same. What he can't do is know that one grape or one press is distinguished from the other and he wants to mix them, meaning that he wants to dilute the better with the not so good. So that's the little addendum here, which we'll have to understand a little bit better, is so what can you do? You can go around from press to press, and you can take all the thing, put it into one cask, and then you sell that because it's like kind, right?
Yeah,
But if you have a person who only deals, let's say, in better wine, let's say he deals in higher quality wine, and it's known that he does, then he cannot be misarev, even if he's taking from all 5 different presses, because there is a qualitative difference between one wine and another.
this is, and Michael knows far more about this than I do. This is the difference between a single malt and a blend.
Well,
Right. Yeah.
but even some vintners, they have different quality wines, and they may use a different press for different quality wines. So this is where you have to be medactic about if the grapes are the same across the presses, then it's not a problem. But if you're using different presses for different grapes in the same vineyard, then it's a delineation because if you mix, you're tainting the quality. So I assume that this again this is a admonition that you have to be open with the public as to exactly what you're doing.
Right.
But does this also mean that if you're buying your grapes from a wholesaler, that all these bets are off too? That you're going to get difference in quality in wines that may come from different places, and they may do a blend, as Menashe said. So they don't have to adhere to this.
Well, I mean, that's the overriding question here: is how do we treat a tager? And since this Mishnah is talking about a tager, we're not talking about a retailer here. We're saying a tager may take the grain, or the tager may take the wine from the different presses or whatever, and mix them together. Then we're making a pronouncement here that tager has namonis. That, in other words, it's not the same as the earlier part of the Mishnah that where you can't sell him wine and water because he'll cut it further. We're saying that the Tager, who is the only one, it's the retailers don't have this capability. The Tiger is the one who has the silo and he has the large cask, so he can amalgamate all of this together. So he has that mnemonis for that, not for the other thing, Michael, that we talked about mixing with water. But it seems from this Mishnah, now that I think of it, is that he does have an mnemonis that if he's going to mix all these grains, all these wines together, that he's not going to cheat. And he's just going to sell them to the retailers the way they are. In other words, he's not going to say, that he'll cut the wine further, or I don't know about grain what he would do, but he'll cut the wine further so that it goes further. It seems that
So
he
there's
does have a certain
stringency in
mnemonis.
wine that isn't in grain for the Tager, there's a stringency here that he needs to maintain that delineation.
Say it again. What did you say, Michael? Say it again.
I said, does this imply that the Tager has to delineate when he's dealing with multiple types of wine? Unlike grain where he's substituting, but because as a wholesaler he's dealing in different classes of grades of wine, that he has to maintain that separation. So you can trust them there, but not in the other instance.
I think that when it comes to the gathering of the grain or the wine, either one, we're giving the Tager a certain mnemonis that, since that's the standard of way, that's the only way people do it. In other words, how are you going to have grain down the road after the harvest, or wine down the road? So they'll gather it and sell it, gather it and sell it. It's when you tempt them with, okay, I can water down this wine, or I can do something to the grain. Again, with grain, it's not so clear, but with the wine, I can water it down and get away with it. That's when we put the handcuffs on him and say, no, you can't do that. But when it comes to simply gathering wine or gathering grain and then selling it piecemeal to the retailer, there it seems like we're not as worried about his
We
mnemonis.
trust them more there than we do here, even though
Right.
there's more variety here and more of a chance for him to compromise
Right,
when he's
right.
selling. It's inconsistent.
It's inconsistent, but it seems from the Mishnah that we're giving the Tager more latitude in this last scenario than we are in the first scenario.
Right. After we don't trust them, we give them a little more
We give it a
latitude.
little latitude. I'm going to look further into it, but it seems that that's what the Mishnah is saying. All right, now, but look at the last line. V'votshri miskaven la'orev. In other words, the merchant, the Tager, let's say he buys high quality grapes or into wine from a particular place, and it's known that he goes to this exotic place and he gets the best wine and everything else. Okay, everybody knows that, and therefore, if he comes back and sells it, of course he'll sell it for a higher dollar because it's higher quality wine. Says the Mishnah that under those circumstances, you can't, in the case of the wines that you gather and put into one cask that are roughly comparable, no problem. You don't have to say anything. But here, if you that if he's going to mix some inferior or weaker wine into this high quality wine, then he has to announce. The Mishnah wants to make a chilek. When does the Tiger have to announce and when he doesn't have to announce? If the routine is that he's gathering all the wine, the wine that's being pressed at one time, and it's roughly the same quality, it's the same grapes from different wineries, from different presses. That's not a problem. The problem arises if he deals with different grades of wine, and he has a very high grade wine that he sells, and everybody knows it, and they're willing to pay more money. Then he has to be scrupulous and not say, "Oh, I'm going to mix a little bit of wine from this other casket. Who's going to know it's wine? It's not water, it's wine." So he's going to dilute it a little bit. That's what the Mishnah says. He shouldn't have the intention of mixing in order to delude trick his customer. So again, because wine and wine, I'm assuming wine and wine is less detectable than wine and water. If you have wine and water, then the chayra maybe it's more to the educated palate, but wine and wine might not be as clear. So that's why the Mishnah puts this pronouncement and says, no, you cannot. If you're going to announce that you're selling high grade wine, then you have to stick with high grade wine. You can't do anything else. Let's just look at Rashi. The Tager Notel Mechamesh Koronos, he can take from 5 different threshing floors. Why? Everybody knows he doesn't grow it from one field. Again, it's about what the public knows. The public knows that there isn't enough grain from one field to accommodate everything, so he has to amalgamate from different fields. Okay? Magura, Otzer, what it's an Otzer Shogumbo Tavua. That's what he means by a silo. I get what we call a silo, that you gather the Tavua. Ogrenbo Tvua, Goren hu, Shedashin Vizorin bo es Tvua, Vederach Hatager Liknos Mibale Batim Bishas Hagoren. And that's his practice, to go from granary to granary and to gather up the grains. Lahachzis Magura Shalom, and to put it into his own silo for safekeeping. So that's how he explains what it is. Now, the last Rashi, dealing with what we just said, Shelo Yiskaven La'arif, Lahotzi Kol Liknos Harov Mimokom Mishubach. In other words, most of the wine he buys from a place that is higher quality. La'aravo, to mix it, Mimkom Acher, V'shchenev Sovrim, Shekol HaPeros Ma'osamakam. In other words, he is known as a quality wine seller. So everybody knows he's going to charge more, but they're willing to pay because he has that reputation. He can't then surreptitiously say, I'm going to take advantage and I'm going to take from the cask that has all the regular wines and put it into this, and no one will know. So that's the exception to the rule where he has to announce. Normally, you don't have to announce when you're selling from the wines of different presses in one cask, because we're saying they're all alike. The only exception is when he is known to be a quality wine seller, that he has that achrayus. Again, this entire Mishnah, and we'll see now in the Gemara Mishnah next week, the entire Mishnah is laying out for us very clearly how not to be deceptive. And sometimes it's a very subtle thing. You know, if I say something, if I don't say something, am I being deceptive? So the Mishnah was very, very careful. You see, the Gemara is really going to get into this and try to tear it apart. But at least from what we understand now, I think we have a fairly good understanding of what responsibilities people have. It's always best to be upfront. The question is, when you're not upfront, are you deceiving or not? And that seems to be what the public perception is. If the public perception is that this wine is all the same, regardless of where it comes from, or the grain is the same, then there's no need to announce. Just like there isn't the need to announce when you're mixing old into new grain because it's better, but you have to, if you're going to mix and you're going to put new into old, then you can't because you're minimizing. So it's all about being transparent. Transparency is really what we're after. And the Mishnah is telling us you don't always have to be fully transparent when there is no expectation that there will be any cheating or hanky-panky going on. So that's the end of the Mishnah, and Mishnah, we'll see in the Gemara, there's a lot of twists and turns to this as to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So Linetta, next week we should be able to get through that, hopefully get through the whole thing next week.